the last portion of class, we're going to have a guest speaker join us. And as I think at least some of you know, I'm very excited to feel a little privileged that former State Senator Gloria Romero is going to join us. And I think what will be particularly valuable about her visit for you guys, aside from her obvious commitment to education reform, is the difference between being an advisor or a consultant or a staffer and being the principal, being a candidate or an office holder. A few years ago, about 2.5 years ago, Governor Schwarzenegger appointed me to chair a commission. And I'd worked in politics for many, many years. I thought, okay, this won't be that different. And all of a sudden, instead of being the person whispering advice to somebody else, being the person whispered to is a much different kind of dynamic. So what I've been able to do over the course of the few weeks we've had together, and I'll hopefully do tonight a week from now, is be able to talk through a variety of the strategic and tactical challenges and opportunities that exist on a political campaign or in any type of political advocacy opportunity. Hearing directly from us as a candidate, but a many times successful candidate, I think is going to give you an additional and a very valuable perspective. So she'll be here a little bit later, and again, I think it's something that I think you guys will really benefit from. So for the first 2.5 class periods, we talked a lot about message development, about how to mine, how to do an inventory of your own biography, your own life experience, your own issue and public policy priorities to put together a message. And what we began to do in the last class meeting before Memorial Day was we began to talk about message delivery. And what we talked about, as you may remember a couple weeks ago, is we began to talk about message delivery of the type that you will do the most of as a candidate or as a campaign staff or volunteer, particularly for a local or a school board or a legislative office, and that's person-to-person canvassing. And we can certainly come back and spend more time on that later today or a week from now, if you like. But what I want to do with the last couple of class meetings that we have is to talk about message delivery, not from a person-to-person perspective, but from a broader perspective. How to communicate with larger audiences of voters. And because, at least in the early stages of your political careers, you'll have relatively limited opportunities for paid media messaging. What we're going to do is talk about two other types of mass messaging. Tonight we're going to talk about delivering a message through the news media, and then next week we'll talk about delivering an online message. But certainly if you have any questions about paid media or advertising, I'm certainly more than happy to talk about those as well. But the primary topic for tonight's discussion before Gloria joins us is to talk about using the news media as a mechanism through which to deliver your campaign message. And the first thing I want to talk about, even before we get into the mechanics of message delivery through news media, be it print or broadcast or online, is I want to talk a little bit more conceptually for just a couple of minutes on toward a couple of points. The first being the importance of developing and maintaining relationship with news reporters. And I bring this up because it's really, really easy, regardless of your partisan leaning, regardless of your ideology, to very quickly begin thinking of the news media as your enemy, and worse, to treat them that way. Republicans for years and years and years have thought that the media was a bastion of liberals out to get them. Any number of Democrats, starting with the current Secretary of State, have referred to the news media collectively as that vast right-wing conspiracy. And the news media, while they're very, very good at many things, they don't do a particularly good job of defending themselves in this regard. Because when they see that Republicans think they're too liberal and Democrats think they're too conservative, the natural reaction from a news media representative, reporter, editor, news director, whoever, is saying, well, if everybody's mad at us, then we must be doing something right. And if you think about it from a really narrow perspective, they're making a good point. If conservatives think they're too liberal and liberals think they're too conservatives, then they must be playing it right down the middle. But as I think most of you know, particularly from your classroom experience, if everybody's mad at you, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing everything right. And I've tried to make the case over the years to any number of news media leaders that while they are technically right from a very specific ideological standpoint, there are probably better defenses against those kind of criticisms. But regardless of whether news media representatives decide to offer those defenses or not, it's particularly important for you, whether you're a candidate or an advisor or a volunteer, is to remember that the news media is not an enemy. And in fact, the news media can be a very valuable ally. Now, media is not necessarily an intentional ally. Their job is to be as even-handed as possible in their coverage of a campaign. But the way I always looked at it is if I did a good job of articulating my message, of delivering my message to the news media, I didn't need them to be biased for me, although that wouldn't have been such a bad thing. I didn't need them to be biased to me, but if I did my job in terms of message delivery, I didn't need them to report on me favorably. I just needed them to report on me accurately. And so rather than thinking of the news media as an enemy, what I would suggest to you instead is to think of a reporter who may be assigned to your campaign. Think of that reporter as a co-worker. And I know what you're thinking. A co-worker doesn't work in a different building. A co-worker doesn't report to a different boss. And a co-worker doesn't necessarily disagree with me or challenge me on most of the things that I'm trying to accomplish in my job. Well, of course, that's not necessarily true. We've all had co-workers who worked in different physical positions. We've all had co-workers who had a different direct report. And we've all had co-workers, I know you guys have, we've all had co-workers who challenged you when they disagreed with you or you didn't think they were providing them with complete information. So the reporter's job isn't to make you look good. The reporter's job isn't to get you elected. The reporter's job, ideally, is to cover your campaign or your campaign event as accurately and in as even-handed a manner as possible.
I don't know what exactly you're referring to when you say the media, but do you feel like, I guess a lot of news stations these days, like MSNBC or Fox, are kind of politically biased? Do you think they're really coming at a situation like a campaign with that mentality of I'm going to handle this as fairly as evenly as possible?
From 7 or 8 o'clock at night on, no. And Sean Hannity and Rachel Maddow would be the first to tell you that that's not what their job is.
Sure.
But the people who anchor the news programs during the day for those two stations, for the most part, and there's certainly exceptions to both of them, for the most part strive to provide the information in as even-handed a way as possible. And when we talk more later today and more next week about online media, we'll talk about the preponderance of advocacy-based media, particularly as it relates to online coverage. But for what I will call, I'll use the term of art, the mainstream news media, a newspaper or a non-advocacy-based website in your community, a radio or television station in your community, not a talk show host, but their news side, they might not always report things in a completely even-handed 50-50 manner. But for the most part, that's their goal. And when they miss it, it's not because of malice or bias. It's generally because I believe that I haven't done as good a job as I could have of providing them the information and the context for that information that I need. Now, do reporters and editors, do they have ideological leanings? Of course they do. But the best of them are able to leave that out of their reporting. And even if they don't leave it out of their reporting, even if occasionally a reporter's own bias creeps in, it does happen. The single worst thing I can do is treat that reporter as if he or she is the enemy. Think about it. Tell me your name again, I'm sorry.
Tanya?
Tanya. Suppose Tanya and I work together. We work together in adjoining classrooms at the school. And every morning, we come in at about the same time. We walk in from the parking lot together. Say, Tanya, how was your night? Tanya, how was your weekend? How are things going in class? We chat back and forth. That's one way to be a coworker. The other way is for me to just completely ignore her. Every day I get out of my car, I walk right past her, come out of the teacher's lounge, and maybe I nod, and hey. I'll see her struggling with an armload of books, don't offer to help. I'm still their coworker, right? So after 6 months of this, I come up to Tanya in the hallway. I say, Tanya, I'm moving this weekend. Would you be willing to take the weekend and help me move? Now, if I'm that first coworker, the one that talks to her every day, asks her how she's doing, helps her with various tasks, and ideally she does the same for me, well, probably not, but she might. Then when I ask her to move, help me move, there's no guarantee that she's going to help. But the chances are a lot better, right? What if I'm that second coworker? The one who brushes past her every day, who greets her with a monosyllable, just grunts at her. And then all of a sudden one day I pop up and say, hey Tanya, can you help me move this weekend? What's Tanya going to do? She's going to tell me to pound sand. And the same challenge exists with a reporter. There's an old saying that you never pick an ink fight with somebody who buys it by the barrel. And whether you are dealing with a newspaper reporter who literally still employs ink for his or her craft, or an online or a broadcast reporter, the same principle holds. If I'm mad at the Los Angeles Times, the only people who knows it are me and the Times reporter, editor who I'm talking. The Los Angeles Times is mad at me. Everybody from northern San Diego County up to Santa Barbara knows. And is it a fair fight? No. But the world is an imperfect place. So the point I'm trying to make is that even if you don't think the reporter is genuinely committed to covering your campaign in an even-handed way, still the worst thing you can do is treat that reporter as an enemy. Because what happens when you treat somebody like an enemy? They respond in kind. And if not, just ignoring and disregarding Tanya, but if frequently over the course of our time working together, I confront her, and I argue with her, and I not only disagree with her, but I question her moral and ethical grounding on the decision she's made. If I treat her like an enemy long enough, what's going to happen? She's going to become an enemy. And if I spend all day, every day, if I spend the entire campaign telling the news media who are covering me, whether they're covering me on a daily basis like they might be in a campaign for Congress or for statewide office, or if they're covering me on an intermittent basis, like they're likely to for a school board or a legislative or a local campaign. If every opportunity I treat them like the enemy, they're human beings. And the more you treat them that way, eventually they're going to respond in kind. So before we talk about the mechanics and the logistics of working to attract news media coverage, I wanted to start with that broader philosophical point. Because it's easy, it's tempting to begin to get suspicious of reporters. You know why? Because think about it. If you're a candidate, think about who you deal with over the course of the day. If you have paid staff, you deal with staff. They're paid to like you, or to pretend they like you. You talk to donors, or prospective donors, who are either going to give you money, or at the worst, they're going to say, hey, thanks, but no thanks. You're going to deal with volunteers, who are giving up their time because they like you. Which means the only personal encounter you're going to have over the course of an entire day on the campaign trail, unless you happen to run into your opponent or one of his or her supporters, the only person you're going to meet all day long who's personally, totally, truly, madly, deeply invested in your success as a candidate is a reporter. And they're not against you. They're just not for you. But if everybody else you deal with is on your team, it's really easy to overreact when you find somebody who isn't. One of the things I always wanted to do when I was working in campaigns, I could never figure out a way to do it. I always wanted to take my candidates to a news conference that the other side was having. Because a reporter's job is to question and to challenge. And sometimes they do that aggressively. And if you're the only person you see them questioning aggressively, it's really easy to develop a complex about it. How come that reporter is always picking on me? So I say, hey, let's go over and watch the other side. You go over and watch Danielle Bennett's campaign, they're just as mean to her. But I never could figure out a way to do that, so I didn't. So I just tell you guys instead.